protector of Julie, his jungle queen. Only I can see that the secret which unites them.
Have you wondered what it's like living in a cardboard box? Well, Maxx knows all about that and how to survive in the primitive outback. Created by Sam Keith, the Maxx animated series takes the story inspiration from an American comic book series by the same name published by Image Comics. The series graced the television in 1995 and was part of a more extensive MTV program called The Oddities. With its very adult content, this underrated cartoon has been groundbreaking with its dark surrealism and outright focus on deeper psychological issues. The show deviates from superhero serving justice in spandex. In another way, it's been more realistic and emphasized the intricacies of the human mind. Let's dive into the story to give you a total recount of all that happened in this series.
Sometimes it's me.
Yes, and sometimes it's us.
The odd living circumstances of Maxx. The story follows a bizarre-looking homeless superhero called the Maxx, who traverses reality and a subconscious world called the Outback. Max's only friend in the real world is freelance social worker Julie Winters, while in Pangaea, the Outback, Maxx is the protector of Julie, the jungle queen, and her pet leopard. This part of the story is narrated by a middle-aged man called Mr. Gunn, a serial rapist and the ultimate adversary of Julie and Maxx. Voiced by the late Barry Stigler, Mr. Gunn was one of his most notable works. However, Mr. Gunn is the only one who knows the connection between Maxx and Julie and can either help or destroy them. But for now, he wants to have fun. Sounds weird? Yeah, it is. And this is the opening of every episode in this series. Episode 1 begins in a dark, wet alley where Maxx lives in a small cardboard box. Maxx describes the fate of many women who fall prey to evil perverts in such vicinity. After a woman is dropped off by a cab driver 3 blocks away from her destination, 2 men called Tigo and Fridge attack her. They break her ankle and snatch her purse. But Maxx comes out of his box to save the woman. The police arrive but don't see the woman in distress. Instead, they arrest the purple-suited, yellow-clawed, masked and humongous Maxx. As the police leave with Maxx, the woman is left at the mercy of a more sinister person wearing a long blue cloak, who we can only assume is Mr. Gunn. The animation style used for the Maxx is quite path-breaking, as the main comic panels are used and set in motion. What makes the delivery truly different is that the creators haven't changed the majority of the art and style, except when needed for a more concise storytelling. The police talk about not finding any distressed woman and book Maxx for loitering. They describe Maxx as a homeless nutcase who wears purple spandex and mumbles. This is a common gag used in the entire series, where Maxx can be seen narrating his story, but more often loudly for others to hear. In the back of the police car, Maxx zones out with a pounding in his head and travels to the wilderness of the Australian outback. The sound of drums offers the background to Max's monologue as we see a bunch of weird creatures in the outback. Some small white hands try to pull Maxx into the ground, while the queen resembles Julie Winters, who wears a leopard fur bikini. Maxx wants to be a superhero for the queen, but in reality, he spends days rampaging and blacking out. The voices of Maxx, done by Michael Haley, and Julie, done by Glynis Tolkien, are drony and slow, further amplified by melancholic jazzy background music, which sets the tone of the cartoon as dark and quirky. Back in the real world, Julie had been dealing with a lot of paperwork for a homeless person with just a blanket. Julie dresses questionably that almost resembles a hooker and seems generally unbothered by what others think of her. She keeps getting calls from her landlord, and then a creep who turns out to be Mr. Gunn. Mr. Gunn explains that the sex and slaughter are all for Julie. The twisted character of Mr. Gunn is sure to invoke a sense of disgust, something that's often missing among power-hungry supervillains we generally encounter in comics and cartoons. Julie cuts the call, but immediately receives a call from the police about Maxx and prepares to bail him out with some bribe. One of the police officers lectures Julie about her provocative clothing and how it attracts people like Mr. Gunn. Julie ignores the remarks and sends a message by squeezing water out of her blonde hair onto the documents for release. She takes Maxx to her home, promising him a warm bath, while the creepy Mr. Gunn and the creepy little black creature look on.
Huh? Who's there?
Lonely girls in the city jungle. The second episode begins with Maxx describing the various peculiar creatures in the outback, like the outback slug, which is stupid as it can leap but can't land and falls to the ground to splatter. The great northern crabbit is again a combination of, no points for guessing, a rabbit and a crab, but it has an enemy, a predator, which is the carnivorous white izzes that can do anything. The izzes look like a marshmallow with 2 lanky hands, human-like feet and sharp teeth. Its only enemy is the Maxx. The cute little ferocious izzes is, however, our favorite creation with the general disposition of Gru's minions from Despicable Me. Julie describes her abode in the city with a sense of foreboding. The dark city with its gothic art is depicted as broken and with various kinds of people that transform into the weird creatures of the outback in Max's subconscious. Julie claims she has several people to help, but somehow she always comes back to Maxx. She pities Maxx and helps him regularly as his social worker. Several black Isis-like creatures could also be seen creeping on the roofs and dark corners, looking at the people and giggling. The dark Isis steal a spotlight in the real world and keep a watch on Julie's apartment in the city, while Maxx lounges on her couch and fends off white Isis in the subconscious outback. When he wakes up, Julie offers him a coat and hat to keep himself inconspicuous. According to Sam Keith, the episode was too short, and so a lengthy pan of the city and Julie's narration were used to bridge two scenes. The artwork that you see for the cityscape is actually a new painting by Keith. The scene then pans to a laundromat, where two young people, Glory and Tommy, are dyeing their jackets. Glory's playing with a knife when Tommy touches her, and she sends him to get her coke. But an evil, menacing person with a blue cloak encroaches upon Glory. Mr. Gunn is presented almost as an evil sorcerer who rules with the help of the dark Isis. Tommy returns soon, contemplating a steady relationship with Glory, but stares at something in horror. Ironically, Glory can't protect herself even with a knife. The series provides a murky depiction of city life and misogyny. As Maxx leaves Julie's home, Mr. Gunn calls Julie. Talking about his latest act, Julie encourages him to talk more so she can get more ideas about Mr. Gunn, while Maxx notices dark Isis inside the phone booth near Julie's building. Maxx is surprised to see the dark Isis holding two phones to place Mr. Gunn's call. Maxx even calls out the fact that the Isis is only a foot tall and wears a hat and coat, but still no one notices it. Maxx follows the dark Isis through narrow alleys and finally locks it in a dumpster. The episode maintains continuity, and the homeless man from the previous episode can be seen sulking in an alley. The creature bites away the steel and escapes. Maxx follows it and faces Mr. Gunn in front of a gas station. Mr. Gunn calls Maxx Brer Lappin and helps him remember the Outback. He explains that the Isis turn into dark cannibalistic creatures in the real world. The Isis cling to Mr. Gunn while the evil lord orders them to kill Maxx.
Here's my hostage!
The face-off. In this episode, the story starts with Julie. She checks her weight, which has increased by 5 pounds despite the constant dieting. She goes to look for something tasty, but gets abducted by dark Isis lurking in a refrigerator. Meanwhile, Tommy rides in his car to attend summer school to learn algebra. He shaved his head and seems pretty traumatized as he recollects the way Glory is bandaged in the hospital. It seems like Mr. Gunn has barely kept Glory alive. Tommy stops at a gas station before driving off to his CPR class when Maxx and Mr. Gunn appear before him, fighting each other. The series has made impressive use of scanned artwork and CGI to bring the comics to life, especially in the action sequences. Tommy's taken aback to see several identical-looking grannies sitting inside a car. But that's not all. Mr. Gunn's cape falls like a curtain, and he describes himself to Maxx as an untalented student of the mystical arts. Mr. Gunn holds up a woman from Tommy's car as his hostage to threaten Maxx, but Maxx kills the hostage so that she's out of the way. Mr. Gunn gets angry and shoots at Maxx, then goes into his car. The old women Tommy saw turn out to be dark Isis dressed like grannies. Mr. Gunn orders them to attack Maxx and drives away. However, it's more funny than shocking, as Mr. Gunn is left dumbfounded for once. Don't worry, it's only a dummy for Tommy's CPR class, but good enough to depict Max's brutal psychotic persona. The Isis attack Maxx and chew on him as he runs and falls on a dumpster and blacks out. Mr. Gunn pulls out the Isis and uses them to keep the dumpster shut, but covers them with paper bags. To give you some context, the Isis turn into dark, twisted creatures when they come to the real world, but to the human eyes, the Isis appear like any random person based on their clothes. Meanwhile, Maxx has escaped into the outback and rejoices at his strength. He has long mane-like hair, but he's surprised to find Julie the Jungle Queen in a scary state. The Jungle Queen looks pale like a ghost and threatens her bad doll by saying that she'll comb all its hair out. Now, this bad doll could very well be a representation of Mr. Gunn, who is in fact bald and has tied up Julie in his lair at an old costume shop. Mr. Gunn relaxes in his cow-themed bathroom, speaks to Julie about what he's done to Maxx and about the dark Isis, while the Isis play around the toilet with Krabbits. Mr. Gunn has made Julie wear a pink bunny dress and tied her with straps. Julie, in her sardonic tone, tells Mr. Gunn that someone like a cheerleader or prom queen must have turned him down, which leads to his sexual revenge plan concerning Julie. As his plans get revealed, Mr. Gunn smashes a giggly Isis like an ink blot in a fit of frustration. As Julie taunts Mr. Gunn, she finds an Isis tooth that she uses to cut the leather straps. Mr. Gunn agrees with Julie's comment that he has a problem with women. He continues that everybody has a problem with women as they tease and taunt. This is a theme that Sam Keith has repeatedly visited in the series. Even Tommy's father thinks that bad things happen to girls who dress up like tramps. Mr. Gunn retorts that Julie has dropped out of college, set up social work, surrounds herself with dangerous men and wears provocative clothes. He wishes to tell Julie all about their shared pasts, but he stopped when Julie cuts off his head mid-sentence. At the same time, Jungle Queen Julie's doll head falls off because of rigorous brushing. It appears Julie doesn't want to hear the truth about herself, the spirit, animals, and the outback. In the real world, Maxx wakes up and tears off the dark Isis.
Don't worry, it's only me, Mr. Gunn, man of two worlds.
Queen of the Jungle. Continuing from the previous episode, Max is going after the flesh-eating izzes. It's funny how Max is always thinking out loud, and he realizes how odd he looks to the people as someone who's talking to himself, dressed like a weirdo, and running after a 96-year-old granny. In reality, Max is more of a simpleton with the predisposition of an angry child. During the chase, his subconscious takes him to the Outback, where he's after the white izzes. He sees a giant air whale fly over him as the scraps of the city in the Outback confuse him. He forgets why he's been chasing the izzes and is soon attacked by spears that kill even the Susadon in the Outback. Max kills the izzes, but is now hunted by an army of millions of white izzes. Max realizes something is wrong with the Leopard Queen of the Outback. As we go through each episode, it becomes clear that this cartoon doesn't use any typical opening sequence and uses an assortment of different clippings from each episode along with Mr. Gon's narration. The narration and clippings remain the same for every episode. As someone throws a net over Outback Max, he gets pulled into the other world in a bathroom. He tries to comprehend the surroundings when Mr. Gon appears wearing a tribal Maori-like mask. Mr. Gon hits Max with the mask and asks him to send Julie a message, and a scuffle ensues between them. Although Julie's cut off Mr. Gon's head, this world appears to be his subconscious. Mr. Gon keeps calling Max the Brer Lapin, which comic readers know as Julie's spirit animal. Mr. Gon uses the word mommy to stop Outback Max from hurting him and explains that only the Outback world is the real one and the city is the subconscious. Mr. Gon informs Max about his connection with Julie and how Julie and the Leopard Queen are the same person. Mr. Gon explains to Max that Julie is lost and imprisoned in the Australian Outback by her self-loathing, while she only puts up the appearance of a confident girl in the real world. He implores Max to return to Julie and protect her. Max shares about the conversations and his thoughts with Julie as he cuts her toenails. This scene's used to signify their relationship and position of power. Max continues how Julie was an architecture student who got kidnapped, beaten, raped, and left to die. But she recovered and used her tuition money to set up her freelance social work. Max's comment coincides with the view of the Outback where the Jungle Queen is sitting inside a mud house. Interestingly, this is one of the rarest times Max speaks in the third person about himself and Julie. However, speaking in the third is common for him in crossover shows. Julie quips about how she hates those who consider themselves victims and Max's liberal feminist garbage, but leans on Max for support. In the Outback, the Queen sheds a tear while Julie says she's fine. But is she?
Turned out he was a superhero fighting this villain called Mr. Gon.
Sarah's story. In the 5th episode, we're introduced to a new character called Sarah James. Sarah is a teenager with bushy hair, and for the better part of this episode, we can only see her silhouette and dorky glasses. The deep, rusty, whiny voice Amy Daniels uses to portray Sarah feels too authentic and age-appropriate. Sarah meets Max in the underpass of a bridge outside the city. She wants to be a writer and is amused by the stories of Max's adventure in the Outback. However, she's most intrigued by the stories about Mr. Gon's cow-themed bathroom. Max has said that he knew Sarah's father. She recalls her dad, who had shot a bunch of people in his office before killing himself. Sarah lives with her mum, who tries to bond with her. However, the incident about her father has left a profound emotional impact on both of their minds. Sarah's mom, Tilly James, is portrayed as someone who's recently started sporting a retro hippie look, although Julie's character deviates from the stereotype occasionally. As Tilly speaks to Sarah, the scene pans to the entire room and walls filled with motivational and movie posters. Sarah confesses in a monologue that she carries a gun, and sometimes she wishes her dad had shot her mother instead. Sarah's mom also sends her to Julie for counseling, but as a 15-year-old, Sarah has a different notion of what's cool and what's not. She finds the adults crazy and relates with Jimmy, the school bully. Jimmy is shorter than Sarah, and he bullies little kids to get the lunch money. Sarah states that she and Jimmy are different, unlike the necro-nerds and the sand freaks. They know death is cold and ugly and not a cute chick. Now, this might be a reference to Sandman comics, as a poster of death from Sandman could be seen in their classroom. A flashback of Jimmy's story also shows how Max has often taken down thugs and thieves in his quest to be a superhero and get rid of the villains. Sarah argues with Julie and keeps referring to herself as fat and ugly with zits and glasses, whose friends think she's a joke. When Tilly comes to take Sarah home, Tilly and Julie engage in a friendly argument that Sarah finds confusing. Max, who had been watching Beavis and Butthead on the TV, overhears the conversations and pities Sarah. But Julie calls her a brat. This is a cartoon that used to be on TV from 1993 to 2011, and maybe used to relate to Sarah's distorted view of the world. Sarah's flashback shows how she was humiliated by Jimmy and the rest of the school during the school dance, and everyone laughed at her. Jimmy later confessed that he doesn't want to be seen publicly with Sarah, but still wants to remain friends. Sarah pretends that she doesn't want to get hurt anymore, and that it's all cool. But she also agrees about being on the brink of pulling the trigger on Jimmy. In a world of Jimmy and Mr. Gon, a psychotic Max and a timid Timmy is still a refreshing take on men. But in the most pathetic moment, Sarah realizes that she would have done the same if she were in his place. She concludes that even a writer has the right to be rotten like anybody else. As the cartoon lingers on rottenness and deep psychological issues, we realize that Sarah is actually Sam Keith speaking to us.
Blue men or something. Maybe he'll do something stupid.
The lonely superhero. In this segment, the story explores Sarah's emotional connection with her late father. She contemplates not killing Jimmy and about her own life, but later decides to go to the movies. She's surprised to find Julie and Max coming out after watching the same film. She tries to stay discreet, but they still notice her. The movie in question is Indecent Proposal, a famous erotic classic from the 90s. Max perceives the film as sexist and claims that it encourages prostitution, while Julie is indifferent to it. They ask Sarah to accompany them, and after some deliberations, she agrees, as it'll make her mom crazy if she hangs out with a hobo like Max for hours. As they're about to leave, the car is hit by carjackers, wearing only their spotted undies. It seems like Mr. Gon and his Izzies have a liking for spotted clothing. Sarah understands that Max sees the carjackers as Izzies. As the self-proclaimed superhero, Max ruthlessly kills the perpetrators. It triggers Sarah's insecurity, and she points her dad's gun at Julie and Max, but also contemplates committing suicide. However, as she decides to live, Julie and Max encourage her to persevere through the pain. Once again, it comes to everyone's notice that Julie is running from her pain. Sarah continues to spend time with Max at the underpass, but rethinks her career as a writer. Another day, Max can be seen chatting with two kids about the origin of the Max. He's wearing a long overcoat and cap to hide his identity. The boys consider various theories, such as the Max being a space alien or an artificial being created by the government. The discussion is a shout-out to the 90s anti-hero plots. Although the entire story is the deconstruction of several superhero tropes, the kids' reference to the cowl and working-class hero also doesn't go well with the Max, because more often than not, Max is the one who gets caught and the bad guys escape. Yet it's clear that despite what many adults think, Max is the image of a hero who gets rid of bad guys. Max indirectly tells the boys that he's a regular guy with a crappy job and no future, who found a mask that changed his life and altered his brain. He explains that his hands turned into a pointy claw when he inserted it into molten lava in the Outback. As the boys refuse to believe this, we do wonder why there isn't a poor and homeless hero like Max. Why are our heroes always billionaires or with superpowers? When Jerry the crackhead approaches the boys for money, the boys stand up to the guy, taking inspiration from the Max. Max looms behind the boys to scare the ruffian. Max overhears the boys' mum asking them to eat and do their homework, so they don't end up as homeless bums. As Max stands alone in the empty street, we can't help but feel pity for him. At least Max has one thing in common with other superheroes. He's a loner with a tragic backstory.
Place. Even I don't come here. Go away. No, go back the way you came.
Max is inner turmoil. Every episode of the Max starts with the sounds of the Izzies chewing and thunder. It's like some sort of foreboding for the morbid circumstances thrown at the heroes. This time, the scene opens on the Outback, and Max is running from a giant monstrous creature called Rek Kwaken and falls into the Jungle Queen's mud house. Mr. Gon's voice could be heard as he instructs the Izzies to use a scanner and spy on Max in the Outback. In the real world, Max falls asleep on Julie's couch while watching a cartoon. Max is now almost settled in Julie's house, who tries to wake him up, but gives up. Max transforms into one-lined animation. Like the cartoon, the Krappen in a Hat. It's a childish animation that uses rhyming words as dialogue. The Krappen's a cross between the Cat in the Hat and the Singing Frog of Warner Brothers. While Dr. Seuss inspires all of the Outback creatures, this cartoon's another nod to his creations. Max's adventure in the cartoon world might be triggered by Julie's fears, who wonders if the cartoon will distort Max's dreams. Max first wakes up in the dumpster and carries a funny face, but he immediately gets transferred to the Outback, where he finds a dead fish in a bowl which speaks to him as a friend in the Outback. On the other hand, the Krappen in a Hat taunts and teases Max. As fear monsters chase Max in this imagination, the cartoon breaks the fourth wall and discusses the change in animation style. The fear monsters in the cartoon are all named Dave, which is a reference to the Max's real name in the real world. Mr. Gon's minions also watch Max and Julie in the real world. Mr. Gon scolds the giggly Izzies for looking, even if they are without eyeballs. It's a wonder how Mr. Gon is alive, even after his beheading. In his dream, the Krappen in a Hat urges Max to find what's underneath his mask. But Max is too afraid to see his own face, as he feels it might be ugly or of a grotesque bunny. Channing Tatum had once announced working on the project through social media. It'd be exciting to see Channing Tatum bring up Max in a live-action adaptation, and I can't wait to see how this part of the story plays out. In the cartoon dream sequence, Max falls into a tub of diet root beer and realizes that he's in a dream within the dream. He ends up in a place with presumably child Julie, who reproaches Max for entering her private space. In this Outback, Max is only a skull version of his mask. He describes himself as the Eagles album cover. This is a reference to the rock band's preferred cover of using tribal imagery as the covers. However, in this Outback, Max is dead, and the little girl suddenly changes to a horrible dripping hag that asks Max to go away to the dimension he came from. As it gets more confusing than ever, with each dream sequence, Max finally realizes that his Outback might be Julie's mental projection. Julie's Epiphany. In another standalone episode, we find Julie and Tilly spending a day sunbathing and discussing Max, who stuck his claws with glue. They discuss how there's too much violence and gender hatred in the streets, which might be influenced by the media. In the alley, Max's cardboard box is inspected by two boys, who find a dead guy inside. The boys are interrupted by a detective who informs them that he's looking for a crazy psychopath. One of the boys in this scene is modeled as Calvin from the Calvin and Hobbes comic strip, and he even carries a stuffed tiger. Mr. Gunn has sent Hammerhead, a half-shark and half-human villain, after Max. This is perhaps the first instance where we find a typical superhero fight sequence, instead of the mindless punches and thrashes from Max. Ironically, Julie and Tilly's discussions on violence coincide with Max getting chased by Hammerhead. Since Mr. Gunn is beheaded, he's now transformed into a one-dimensional cartoon, speaking to us from Julie's head and delivering a direct commentary on Max's situation. The miniature might be less creepy than the hairy and bald Mr. Gunn, but it doesn't cease to entertain us. This is also perhaps one of the series where the bad guy is way more intriguing than the protagonists. Tilly and Julie's car get stuck in the rain, and they must call a tow truck. However, Julie loses herself to the subconscious. Meanwhile, Hammerhead and Max have also fallen into the water, and Max lands in Julie's subconscious. She and Max face a more seductive but depressed Jungle Queen. Max describes the dark-haired, almost naked Jungle Queen as someone from a bad paperback cover. The art shifts continuously, and again, the cartoony Max from the Crappin' in a Hat and Julie resurface in front of the Queen. The Queen tells them that her leopard is dead. Back in reality, Max and Hammerhead come out of the water, and Hammerhead starts throwing cars and stuff at Max. Max gets inside a shop of cords and gets entangled with them, but realizes that his claws are now free and attacks back. Later, the detective and police find Max amidst the ruins. This episode also adds a gag when the detective complains that fewer police are in the squad. This is because the Dark Izzes have been impersonating police officers. As steel rods from the tow truck break into their car window, Julie again gets lost in the subconscious. In her subconscious, Julie reaches down to the innermost part to find little Julie in the skull of Max. She also finds several leopard cubs. The depressed Jungle Queen turns out to be Julie's consciousness before she was violated, but now it's amassed all the sadness and has changed. The child Julie and the older Jungle Queen help Julie realize the truth about Max living in her dream projection. Little Julie also asks adult Julie to find her spirit animal. Such clarification helps Julie sleep better while Sarah brings Glory back from the hospital. Max has got back to living in the box and wonders how Mr. Gunn is alive. He also laments the cancellation of a series called The Cheers. As Max worries about Mr. Gunn sending more villains his way, we're sure there'll be more twisted measures from Mr. Gunn to disrupt Julie and Max's life.
Max rests under decaying body of air whale.
Julie finds her memory. Remember the dead body found in the last episode? It turns out it was Tiggo's, which is now being examined by a doctor on an autopsy table. As the doctor removes Tiggo's clothes, he changes into a dark Izzes. But soon, the doctor is attacked by more Izzes. Back at Julie's home, Max is sleeping on the couch again, and Julie calls at him from the bathroom as her door is stuck. But Max is in the Outback, and this time he's accompanied by Julie. Surprisingly, we find real-world Max striding beside Julie. He complains that Julie had been telling him that the Outback is a figment of Max's diseased mind, but now she's here with him. Adding to Max's confusion, everything seems smaller and tiny in the Outback since the last time he visited, except for the Requaken, which is still overpowering and slightly taller than Max. As Max and the Requaken fight, Julie scolds them for ruining her supposedly cathartic experience. However, that should be the least of her worries, as soon a million white Izzes approaches and forces them to flee. The Izzes devour the Requaken. Max climbs on a cliff, and Julie treads on the grassy field. Several characters from different Image comics, like Savage Dragon, Mako, and Pit, made cameos in the Max issue numbers 6 and 7, but were replaced in the animated version due to legal reasons. For instance, Pit was replaced by Requaken, and Hammerhead replaced Mako. Meanwhile, Sarah's in the art department, thinking how much she despises Mrs. Brussels and the inventory. She comes across a talking block of clay as she sorts through the boxes. The clay speaks in Mr. Gunn's voice and asks Sarah to bring him to Julie's home. Sarah doesn't want to betray Julie and is no longer shocked by the odysseys since she saw Max taking down the Izzes carjackers. But when Clay repeats that she must see how rotten a writer can be, she freaks out and leaves, asking him to stay away from her head. On the other hand, an Izzes dressed as Calvin from the previous episode breaks into Julie's home. With real-world Max in the Outback somehow, the wild Outback Max now replaces him on the couch. The Outback Max looks tiny in the real world, which means everything is smaller in size in the Outback. Max jumps through furniture and utensils to save himself and beat the dark Izzes, while Julie listens to the sounds from inside the bathroom. Sarah finally brings Clay outside, and the voice offers to show Sarah her spirit animal, the horse, which will help her navigate society and break her walls. All this while, the wild outback Max is fighting the Izzes across Julie's home. He thinks of the cushions as air whales and the plugs as scorpion tails, making for the most bizarre and comedic fight sequence seen in this cartoon. All of these things happen while Julie's still stuck in the bathroom and losing her patience. Sarah sneaks into Julie's home and hides the clay block inside a cabinet, but she's stunned as she witnesses the tiny Max tying up an Izzes. So she leaves quietly, but Mr. Clay calls after her. In the outback, Julie's finally found the mud house, which now looks smaller, like a molehill. Julie remembers how she made the clay house with popsicles. Mr. Gunn, who's been hiding behind the mud house, is terrified that Julie's remembering her past too soon. He fears that if everything goes back to normal now, he'll be dead in the real world with a decapitated head. Mr. Gunn prepares a poisoned dart to attack Julie, but Julie remembers how she was the jungle queen who protected a vast domain from evil. She also remembers her pet bunny. Max realizes Julie is in danger as Mr. Gunn and an outback creature prepare to attack her. With dangers prowling behind Julie, both in her house and the outback, it may finally be the time for Max to be the hero he thinks he is. But will he escape in time to save Julie, or will she save herself?
Showing you the truth.
Stop this!
Sarah's Epiphany. The 10th episode continues the story. Sarah finds a building with strange architecture that has animal heads like a horse and deer popping from the sides. She questions her reality after seeing the Izzes and tiny Max. In the outback, Julie thwarts a monster and catches a tiny naked Mr. Gunn. Simultaneously, in the city, Outback Wild Max throws down an ottoman bench from Julie's window, with the Izzes tied to it. He then sneaks inside the bathroom to help Julie, but his mask falls off, revealing a face that horrifies and astounds Julie. In the outback, an air whale rescues Max from the cliff and flies away with him. Back in the city, Sarah climbs onto a building and finds a spot directly facing the horse from the macabre building. She waits for the horse to speak to her. Sarah might not be the main character in this series, but the sequel to the comic series has a 10-year-old Sarah as the lead, a new villainous monster, Iago, from her outback, and her own Max. So despite this series ending with one season, there's a chance for a revival of Sarah's story. All this while, Julie's tormented by seeing Max's face, and Mr. Gunn pushes her to remember a lampshade that looks like Max's mask. Water drops on glass, something blue and wet. He explains how a part of him is lurking inside Julie's room. However, Mr. Gunn doesn't clarify about the clay block. He also tells Julie that communication with her other selves has ruined the barriers between the two worlds. Julie fights back and rips off tiny Mr. Gunn's head again in the outback. In the real world, it's been 3 weeks since Sarah is coming up to see the horse. The drawing of the city and its atmosphere has a resemblance to Gotham. The crime and grime of the two cities are almost identical. Did you know there's a crossover comic about Batman facing the Maxx? It's called Batman, the Maxx, Arkham Dreams issue number 4. Coming back to Sarah, she now remembers the motivational poster from her mom's bedroom with a Margaret Keane-style big-eyed girl's picture. This is again a goof-up by the creators, as the poster was already shown in episode 5, hanging in Sarah's room along with other posters. The thought of the poster makes Sarah cry, as she feels that the horse has spoken to her. The scene with Sarah meditating in front of the horse sculpture was actually cut from the comic due to lack of space, but the cartoon has utilized it effectively to portray Sarah's epiphany. Things also look up for Max and Julie, who are stuck in the outback, as the air whale drops Max beside Julie, sitting on top of the mud house. They suddenly get transferred to the real world, where they're perched atop a mailbox. Sarah comes across them in the street and helps Julie into a home, and on their way they see Julie's faux ottoman lying on the streets. Well, it's not a superhero show without some destruction and ruined furniture. Sarah leaves, but Julie gets a foul smell inside her apartment and has yet to find the block of clay. Max is also sure that Mr. Gunn isn't lying, and with Mr. Gunn finally gaining entry to Julie's home, things are bound to get messy.
Reach down its throat, turn it inside out.
Tale of the Beheaded Head. This part of the story begins a little differently, as we no longer get the same intro as the rest of the series. Instead, Mr. Gunn gives us a short rundown this time, as he gossips and mocks the characters and what's happened so far. We particularly like how Mr. Gunn suggests that Julie uses her bad fashion choices as a political statement. It's quite innovative for the creator to deconstruct its protagonists. He even mocks us, as Mr. Gunn laughs at adults like Max who watches cartoons. After Mr. Gunn finishes recapping the story, we find him speaking through a tape recorder to the doctor from the autopsy lab. The doctor is tied and held beside Mr. Gunn's cow motif bathroom by the dark Izzes. As Mr. Gunn describes what's happening in the city right then, we find Sarah, Glory, and a few other kids hanging out in the playground with Max. Glory speaks about going to therapy and how nobody can defeat Mr. Gunn. Max, wanting to tell them about his own heroics, tells them a story about fighting the Daikat, a tiger-like carnivorous plant. Meanwhile, Julie's sitting on the toilet and considering if Max is her spirit animal. The Outback Maxx had the face of a bunny, and she realizes how her consciousness and manifestations may have confused Max's identity. As she looks for toilet paper and paper towels, she wonders about her relationship with Max and who or what Max is. Although the series doesn't clarify it, the comics reveal Max in the real world is actually the reanimated corpse of Dave, who was once run over by Julie. At the same time, Max continues his story on how to kill a dicant by pulling its inside out and throwing it into the water. However, he failed to notice that millions of white Izzes were on their suicide migration and prepared to jump on the water while the Mwitabe managed the horde. The Mwitabe are again godlike creatures who are actually guardians. The story goes a bit overboard with the dark and unearthly themes, but it's actually symbolic. But just as the Izzes were about to throw Max over a cliff, a Buick arrives and saves him. Naturally, this story doesn't make sense to the children who leave. Mr. Gon then tells the story about another part of the city as he recollects about leaving a hole between the Outback and the real world. The hole is discovered by two children in an alley. Mr. Gon had left this hole to return and find his daughter, but to the children's surprise, an unchanged white Izzes creeps through the hole to enter the real world. One of the boys' arms gets stuck in the hole, but the unbothered white Izzes climbs to Julie's apartment to spy on her. Sarah arrives to confess to Julie, but she's already found the box with a rotten smell and attempts to open it. As Mr. Gon's decapitated and putrid-smelling head rolls out of the package, Sarah realizes it's her dad's head. No wonder Mr. Gon had been calling Sarah the apple of his eye and a breath of fresh air. So, is this all about Mr. Gon's repentance? Why does he want Julie to remember her past so desperately? Mr. Gon's fairy tale. We finally get a little more clarity on Julie's subconscious in the second last episode of the series, as the story finally makes some sense. The episode starts with Julie and Sarah packing things in Julie's apartment. Sarah shares how she was shocked when the white Izzes snatched Mr. Gon's head and ran. She also seems angry at her father for abandoning her and being a serial rapist and murderer. Meanwhile, Mr. Gon forces the doctor to stitch back his head, and while the doctor works, he recounts the story of little Julie. Interestingly, the art style in this episode is quite different, with clear and colorful animation, like a fairy tale. While specific incidents from Julie's childhood are depicted as a child's drawing on a copy, the flashback shows Mr. Gon as a heavier person called Artemis or Artie. He was Julie's father's friend, often visiting them and telling stories about the Australian outback and its eccentric creatures. Julie's dad was an architect who designed office buildings, but he wanted to be a cover artist. It appears that his life was manipulated and controlled by his dominating wife. The story also shows how Julie was like her dad when she was a child, but became more like her mom with age. One day, a car ran over a bunny, and Julie took the injured bunny and kept it underneath her bed. However, the barely alive bunny made a scraping noise that disturbed the family. It's quite unnerving how the cartoon fringes toward horror. The background music and the voiceover are far creepier than Mr. Gon's phone calls to Julie. In the present, Julie refuses to throw out any of the damaged and broken things, which is probably why she kept the dying bunny beneath her bed. Meanwhile, the dark Izzes are tormenting the single white Izzes as Mr. Gon warns the doctor that the sadistic monsters will do the same to him. Mr. Gon continues with the story of little Julie. Julie's parents took the bunny to the garage and lied to her, while she remained quiet and aggressively combed her doll's hair. This doll represents Artie, or Mr. Gon, and the aggressive combing results in the doll's head breaking off. The episode also illustrates how Julie realizes that her childhood imaginations and experiences developed the Outback, and now she wants to eliminate all of that. One night, Julie witnessed her mum bludgeoning the bunny to death, but this incident scarred her for life. Sarah probes Julie about how she's leaving the city to distance herself from her codependent relationship with Max. Julie asks Sarah to throw away the shovel her mother used to kill the bunny and keeps pulling plants from a pot as we see her Outback rotting. With all the secrets bared, it looks like Max's adventure in the Outback is coming to an end.
What if you're trapped in a world that I created?
Goodbyes are difficult. In the final episode, Julie bids goodbye to Max as she prepares to leave the city. They talk on the rooftop, and Julie tries to explain her decision, but Max is sulking. Julie feels it's the only way she and Max could become free of each other and live a more normal life. Two boys hang around Max's cardboard box and discuss who's weak and cruel between Max and Mr. Gon. Sarah is also sitting inside the box, and after the boys leave, Julie comes and sits beside Sarah, telling her how difficult it's been to communicate with Max. As she leans on the box, it rips from one side. For some reason, Julie's always barefoot, even when on the streets. The artwork for the architecture changes a lot in the last few episodes, as the unnamed city now doesn't look like a more distorted version of Gotham. It feels like the city might be healing. In the Outback, Wild Max is moping about Julie leaving, and he's suddenly pulled underground by the white Izzes and caught in a net. Inside Julie's building, a glass tube transforms into Mr. Gon's head. Mr. Gon has come to straighten up his karma and make it right with his daughter Sarah, who's probably the only person he truly cares for. Gon tries to explain to Max about Julie's and Max's past connection. Mr. Gon explains to Max that he's not a bunny rabbit in the real world and that Max should let Julie go to see what his Outback looks like. But before Mr. Gon could finish revealing the truth, Max stamps on his head to finish him off. It looks like the creators and their protagonist don't want the non-comic readers to know the actual story. This might again be due to the fact that the comic wasn't finished until 1998. In the Outback, Max claws out of the net and goes through a tunnel to find a light at the end of the tunnel to find the Jungle Queen. Julie hurts her leg walking barefoot and tells herself she must watch where she's going barefoot. This might be explained as being too distracted or in a trance that she forgets to wear her shoes. Julie then asks Sarah if she's told Tilly that this city might also be a projection or dream that Julie has, and once she wakes up, it might be all gone. Sarah says she's left that part out, and they return to the apartment. The cartoon concludes the story based on Max issue number 11, and the last scene is relatively unfamiliar to the fans of the comics. Julie bids a final goodbye to Max, who's afraid that once Julie leaves, he'll be lost. Julie is equally sad to leave Max and blames it on him, just like how she blames everybody for their plight. Eventually, Julie explains to Max that she cares for him, and as Julie drives off, Max sheds his mask and suit to come out of the tunnel in the Outback as a burly man. He goes to work in his greenhouse, indicating that to be his new and personal Outback. The plants in Max's greenhouse also resemble the jungle creatures in Julie's Outback. In a way, Max and Julie will always remain connected through their subconscious as the protector and the protectee. The series leaves several unexplained concepts, like the broken lampshade resembling Max's mask and the broken glass, which would have detailed how Max came into being. A revival of the show would be great to tie these loose ends. Creatives may also work on the second story arc. However, the most defining part of the series has been the betrayal of Mr. Gon and the Izzes, inflicting sadistic, humorous torture on the protagonists. What do you think are the highlights of the series? What do you think a possible revival should look like?